In the autumn of 1845, something strange began happening along the west coast of Ireland. Potato fields that had been green and healthy the day before turned black overnight, rotting in the ground before they could be harvested. The smell was overwhelming, sweet, heavy, the smell of something dying on a massive scale. The farmers who knelt in those blackened fields didn't know they were witnessing the beginning of the largest humanitarian catastrophe in 19th-century European history. They didn't know that within 7 years the population of their island would fall by a quarter. They didn't know that their children and grandchildren would end up in New York, Boston, and Chicago, and that 150 years later, their descendants would form the largest ethnic bloc in American politics. All of this because of one vegetable, a vegetable that was itself a stranger on that island, that had arrived less than 200 years before, that had saved Europe from famine and then destroyed it. The potato is the strangest story in the history of food, because it is the story of a crop that did everything right and still became the cause of catastrophe. What if it had never existed? The world you know would look fundamentally different, and not just because there would be no French fries. The poisonous stranger. The potato very nearly never made it to Europe at all. And when it did, Europe spent 2 centuries trying to get rid of it. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered the potato in the Andes in the 1530s, they found a strange, lumpy tuber that the local people, the Inca, called papa. The Inca had cultivated the potato for thousands of years, developing more than 1,000 distinct varieties adapted to different altitudes and climates. It was the foundation of their civilization. They had developed a technique for freeze-drying potatoes using the extreme cold of Andean nights, producing a preserved food called chuno that could be stored for years without spoiling. A technology of food preservation that existed nowhere else on Earth. The Spanish brought the potato to Europe around 1570. Europe looked at it and decided it was poison. The reasons were several, and each was logical in its own way. First, the potato belongs to the nightshade family, the same family as belladonna, henbane, and other well-known poisons. Its leaves and stems are genuinely toxic. Second, it grew underground, and medieval European medicine held that anything growing beneath the soil carried the dark energy of the earth and was harmful to the body. Third, the potato is not mentioned in the Bible, which meant God had not intended it for human consumption. Across Europe, the potato was banned, burned, and declared a plant of the devil. The French Parliament officially prohibited its cultivation in 1748, claiming it caused leprosy. Scottish Presbyterian ministers refused to eat it because Scripture didn't sanction it. In Russia, peasants rioted against government attempts to force them to grow what they called the devil's apple. It took nearly 2 centuries for Europe to accept the potato, and it happened through deception. Antoine Augustin Parmentier was a French agronomist who had spent 3 years as a Prussian prisoner of war, surviving almost entirely on potatoes. He understood that the only way to make the French eat potatoes was to make them desirable. He persuaded Louis XVI to grant him a field outside Paris for potato cultivation. During the day, the field was guarded by royal soldiers, which immediately convinced the local peasants that something extraordinarily valuable was growing there. At night, The guards were deliberately withdrawn. Peasants crept in, dug up the tubers, and carried them home. That is how the potato conquered France, through theft. But the potato didn't wait for Europe to accept it. It found other ways in. Spanish naval officers discovered by accident that crews eating potatoes on long ocean crossings didn't develop scurvy, the disease that killed sailors on every fleet in the world. They didn't understand why. They simply observed the result. Potatoes contain enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy, unlike most foods that could be stored for months at sea. The Spanish fleet began taking potatoes on voyages. Others followed. Prussia's Frederick the Great understood the military value of the potato before anyone else. During the 7 Years' War, he ordered his peasants to grow potatoes under threat of having their ears and noses cut off. Brutal, but logical. Grain fields could be burned during retreat or advance, which armies regularly did. Potatoes in the ground were invisible, practically inaccessible to foragers. They were a strategic reserve the enemy could not destroy. The savior of Europe. What happened after Europe accepted the potato has no parallel in the history of human nutrition. The potato is close to a perfect food. 1 hectare of potato field produces roughly 4 times the calories of the same hectare planted with wheat. The potato contains almost every nutrient the human body needs: vitamin C, potassium, B vitamins, protein. An Irish peasant living almost entirely on potatoes and milk was receiving a nutritionally complete diet. Sounds like deprivation. Nutritionally, it was close to complete. For the peasant populations of 18th century Europe, the potato was salvation. Before the potato, European peasants lived in permanent fear of famine. A failed grain harvest meant death, and such failures came regularly, cyclically, with terrible predictability. The potato changed this equation. It grew on land too poor for wheat. It produced a crop even in bad years. It fed a family from a small plot, and it was nutritious enough that people who ate it regularly lived longer and suffered fewer deficiency diseases than those who didn't. The result was a demographic explosion of a scale that had no precedent. Europe's population, which had been held roughly stable for centuries by recurring famines, began growing at extraordinary speed. Between 1750 and 1850, it nearly doubled, from around 140 million to almost 300 million people. Historians identify the potato as one of the primary drivers of this growth, alongside improvements in medicine. The potato didn't just feed European peasants, it fed European armies, and this changed the nature of warfare itself. Before the potato, armies were limited in how long they could campaign by the food supply. Soldiers needed grain, and grain was heavy, bulky, and ran out. Armies that moved too far from their supply lines starved. The potato changed this calculation. It grew in the ground wherever armies stopped. It could be dug up and eaten with minimal preparation. It was available in quantities that no supply wagon could match. Napoleon understood this. His Grande Armée that swept across Europe in the early 19th century was fed substantially on potatoes, both foraged from local fields and grown deliberately along campaign routes. An army of 600,000 men, which Napoleon assembled for the invasion of Russia in 1812, could not have existed under the old logistical model. The potato made it possible to concentrate military force at a scale that had never existed before in human history. The Industrial Revolution had the same dependence. The factory workers of Manchester and Birmingham needed cheap, reliable calories in large quantities. Grain was expensive. Potatoes were not. The working-class diet of industrial Europe, potatoes boiled, potatoes fried, potatoes mashed, was not a choice. It was an economic necessity made possible by one crop's extraordinary productivity. Without the potato, the labor force that built the industrial world would have been more expensive to feed, smaller in number, and physically weaker. The potato didn't just feed the Industrial Revolution, it was one of its preconditions. Ireland became the extreme example of this phenomenon. At the beginning of the 18th century, the island held around 3 million people. By 1840, it held more than 8 million. No country in Europe had seen population growth at this rate over this period. The reason was simple and catastrophically fragile. Irish peasants were eating almost exclusively one variety of potato, a variety called the lumper, cheap, productive, undemanding, and genetically identical across the entire island. It was a slow-burning fuse. Nobody knew it was lit. The Great Hunger. Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that arrived in Ireland in 1845, probably from North America on trading ships. For this organism, a genetically uniform potato field was an ideal environment. No resistance, no diversity to slow its spread. It destroyed a crop in days. In 1845, roughly half the harvest was lost. In 1846, almost all of it. In 1847, 1848, and 1849, the disease returned again and again. What followed is known in Irish as An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. Over 7 years of more than 8 million Irish people, approximately 1 million died of starvation and related diseases: typhus, dysentery, scurvy. Another 2 million emigrated within a few years. The population of the island fell by roughly a quarter within a decade. But these are numbers. Behind them is something that numbers cannot describe. Ireland at this time was part of the British Empire, and while the Irish were dying of hunger, food continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain. Wheat, oats, livestock, all of it leaving because the land belonged to British landlords who demanded rent regardless of whether their tenants were dying. Irish peasants could not afford to buy the grain they had grown themselves. It went to market to pay the rent. The British government responded late, inadequately, and with an ideological conviction that market mechanisms would regulate the situation on their own. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official overseeing relief operations, wrote that the famine was a direct act of providence designed to correct the excessive growth of the Irish population. Relief was provided, but with conditions, with delays, in quantities clearly insufficient. People were buried in mass graves without coffins. Entire villages died over a single winter. The roads were lined with the bodies of people who had collapsed walking to the workhouse. When examined, their stomachs contained grass and dirt. The workhouses the British government established as the primary relief mechanism required starving people to perform 8 hours of hard labor per day in exchange for food and shelter. Families were separated on entry, men, women, and children housed apart. People died inside the workhouses themselves, from exhaustion, from disease, from the impossibility of physical labor in a state of extreme starvation. By 1847, the workhouses were so overcrowded they stopped admitting new arrivals. The outside world watched. The Ottoman Sultan Abdul-Majid I attempted to send 10,000 pounds sterling to the Irish. Queen Victoria asked him to reduce the amount to 1,000 pounds so as not to exceed her own donation. He then secretly dispatched 3 ships loaded with food. According to a legend still alive in Ireland, those ships evaded a British blockade at night and unloaded in secret. Whether entirely true or not, a monument thanking the Sultan stands in the Irish town of Drogheda to this day. Whether the word genocide applies to these events is historically contested. That British policy transformed a natural catastrophe into a human one is not. The nation the potato built. Those who fled Ireland during and after the famine ended up most of them in one place, America. Between 1845 and 1855, approximately 2 million people left Ireland. Most crossed on what were called coffin ships, overcrowded vessels where mortality during the crossing sometimes reached 30%. Those who survived arrived in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, sick, destitute, without English, without skills, without anything except the determination to survive. They were not welcomed. Help wanted signs ended with the words, "No Irish need apply." Protestant America looked at Catholic Irish immigrants with contempt and fear. They were described as a lesser race. Newspaper cartoons depicted them as apes. They stayed, and they changed America. The Irish went where others wouldn't, into the police, into the fire departments, into the political machines of urban Democratic Party organizations. They learned to work the system. Votes in exchange for jobs. Loyalty in exchange for protection. Tammany Hall in New York. The political machines of Boston and Chicago. All of this was built substantially on Irish immigrant organization. The Irish didn't just adapt to American urban life, they built the infrastructure of it. The mechanism by which the Irish took political power in American cities is worth understanding in detail, because it was one of the most sophisticated political operations in American history, built by people who arrived with nothing. The Irish political machine worked on a simple principle: deliver votes, receive patronage. An Irish ward boss knew every family in his district. He found jobs for new arrivals, intervened with landlords, paid bail, arranged coal deliveries in winter. In return, he delivered his district's votes reliably and completely on election day. This was not corruption in the way the word is usually used. It was a functioning welfare system built by immigrants for immigrants, in the absence of any government willing to provide one. The scale of Irish penetration of American institutions by 1900 was extraordinary. In New York City, Irish Americans constituted the majority of the police force, the fire department, and the sanitation department. In Boston, every mayor from 1885 to 1993, with two brief exceptions, was Irish Catholic. The Knights of Columbus, founded in 1882, became one of the most powerful Catholic fraternal organizations in the world, with membership concentrated heavily among Irish Americans. The Irish influence on the American military was no less significant. During the Civil War, the Irish Brigade fought on the side of the Union, one of the most famous units of that war. At Fredericksburg in 1862, they advanced on fortified Confederate positions, wearing green sprigs in their caps, the symbol of Ireland, and lost more than half their number in a single day. Confederate soldiers watching the charge, according to eyewitness accounts, removed their hats in respect. These men had fled the potato famine. 10 years later, they were dying for a country that had initially refused to accept them, and with their blood, they purchased the right to call themselves Americans, a right their children and grandchildren would never have to prove. In 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the grandson of Irish immigrants who had fled the famine, became President of the United States. Today, approximately 40 million Americans claim Irish heritage. That is 5 times the population of Ireland itself. St. Patrick's Day, which in Ireland was a modest religious observance, became in America a national celebration because the Irish diaspora needed a symbol of identity in a foreign country, and this was the one they had. The potato famine didn't just kill a nation, it relocated one across an ocean. And in its new location, that nation became a force that shaped American politics and culture for the next century and a half. The lesson we didn't learn. The potato's story didn't end in the 19th century. It is still being written. And the chapter we are currently living through looks disturbingly familiar. The same Phytophthora infestans that destroyed the Irish harvest in the 1840s has never gone away. It has mutated, developed resistance to fungicides, and continues to destroy potato crops around the world. Annual losses from potato blight are estimated at more than $6 billion. In developing countries, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, outbreaks of the disease still mean hunger for specific communities. Modern agriculture has responded to this vulnerability in exactly the same way that Ireland responded in the 19th century, with monoculture. Most of the potatoes grown in the world today are a handful of varieties that are genetically close to each other, optimized for industrial transport, storage, and processing. McDonald's uses primarily one variety, the Russet Burbank, for its French fries, perfect in size and starch content for conveyor belt production. Genetically vulnerable in exactly the way the lumper was in 1845. Meanwhile, in the Andes, where the potato came from, indigenous communities still grow hundreds of traditional varieties in different colors, shapes, and flavors. Purple potatoes and yellow ones and red ones, and varieties that taste like nothing sold in any supermarket anywhere. This is a living genetic library. The International Potato Center in Lima maintains more than 4,000 distinct varieties. It is the insurance policy against what happened in Ireland. Most people eating French fries don't know any of this. They don't know they are eating a crop that once killed 1 million people when it lost its diversity. They don't know we are building the same conditions again. Finale. A world without the potato. Europe's population in the 18th and 19th centuries would not have grown so explosively. Famine would have continued to check it every few generations, as it had for centuries. The Irish famine, as it actually happened, would not have occurred, because neither the demographic pressure the potato created nor the genetic vulnerability of monoculture would have existed. 2 million Irish immigrants would not have arrived in America in the 1840s and 1850s. The Irish political machine that shaped American cities for 100 years would not have been built. Perhaps no President Kennedy. Perhaps a different America entirely. One tuber, grown by the Inca in the high Andes while Europe didn't know it existed. But here is what the history of the potato actually teaches, and what most food history stories leave out. The Irish famine was not a natural disaster that couldn't have been prevented. Nature created the conditions. Policy created the catastrophe. The decision to export grain from a starving country was a political decision. The decision to depend on a single potato variety was an economic decision made to maximize yield at the expense of resilience. We are making the same decisions today across every crop in every country, optimizing for efficiency, eliminating the diversity that is the only real protection against catastrophe. The potato taught us this lesson at the cost of 1 million lives. We didn't learn it.